Um, Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our another session of Working in UX Design. My name is Daylon, and I'm the host for this session. And today we have a special guest. Her name is Adela, and she is the Director of Product Design and User Insights at Zalora, a fashion e-commerce website focused on the Southeast Asia region, right? She has been at the forefront of designing user-friendly and intentional products and services and experiences. And she has both on the client and consultancy side worked across continents, including in America, Europe, and now in Asia. So I first met Adela through a coffee meeting, and I was reminded that her background and origins was that of a service designer first working in Germany. And I'm really, really excited to be talking to her today about service design and how we are in the intersection between service design and UX design and her work that sort of is so multidisciplinary and so multifaceted. So I think that is really, really great that we have her today, Adela. So how's your week going?
It's going pretty well. Pretty excited to be in the podcast. Pretty excited to talk a little bit more about what I do on, like my day to day, and also share a little bit about what are some exciting things I'm looking at, challenges, just, share a few thoughts.
Awesome. And when we talk about service design, what's one thing that people often misunderstand about service designers?
So if I were to think of one thing, I would say the sometimes service design gets pretty caught up in these deliverables, right? Like we talk a lot about service blueprints and tools and really beautiful maps to present results. But service design is a lot more than that, right? These tools and these blueprints, these are all very beautiful and very interesting and great part of the building process. But the reality is, we really create impact in service design through actually, making sure that teams work in a different way or by introducing new ideas, right? So, yeah, I think that's the biggest one, I would say. Like the focus on tools versus the actual results. It's a lot more than just like creating tools or creating great decks or creating great presentations and strategies. It's about all of the work that actually goes into making these a reality.
Okay, excellent. And I think you've been on both sides of the table, right? You've both been on first consulting and then you went in-house. Can you help all of us here understand a little bit, like the difference between being a service designer in consulting versus like being more in-house, and what are the kind of projects that you know that you have worked on in the past? Yeah.
So yeah, so actually, thanks for doing the intro, right? Like I did most of my career in consulting, like over 10 years. And then up until recently, I actually shifted into in-house and it was quite a big change. I think there's like good and bad in both cases. There's no like, I honestly don't have like a preference. You just have like a different set of challenges and fun things that come with each one of these. But I guess if we talk about the biggest difference, I would boil it down to two things. So the first one is the time frame. Because when you're working in a consultancy, you're usually being measured around timeframes, right? Just the way you sell projects in consultancies, you're usually working with companies or with organizations where you sell projects by day or by hours, and you sell like a certain amount of time, which means that you're always kind of like running against the time. So that doesn't always give you a lot of space to do a lot of things that you need to do when you're thinking about service design, right? Like if you really want to start off a project, well, and not only service design, I think this applies also to other projects within UX and all sorts of design. You really need to have a little bit of time and space to understand the context, understand the teams, really understand the problems. And you don't always have that luxury when you're working in consulting. You kind of have to like learn as fast as possible and get a very clear understanding in a very limited amount of time. Like I said, I don't think that's necessarily a good or a bad thing. On the plus side, it means that you develop this muscle where you get to learn very, very fast. So that helps you for the future. On the downside, though, because there's this like time-sensitive factor that is always kind of running in the background, you may sometimes have to omit some like going really deep into a specific part of the research or really talking to that extra user, which is not great, but you kind of make it work. And then the second difference that I would say for me is an even bigger difference, and is I call it like the where you stand in the room, right? Like the point of view that you can bring in. So when you work in consulting, you are kind of brought in to bring in an outside in perspective. So that puts you in the position of an outsider, which again is not a bad thing. It's actually a very good thing, because you can use this to your advantage to, for example, ask questions that might seem obvious or point out some blind spots that some of the people that have been working in these projects and in these teams for quite a long time, they kind of brush them over. So coming in as a newbie or coming in as a new set of eyes actually allows you to ask these like obvious questions that are not really that obvious.
I think those are really excellent points that you mentioned about how it's different bringing like an objective perspective versus like being able to work inside an organization and being able to know everything inside out. And what you're now working in-house, right? You're now at Zalora, you're working in-house. What do you miss about consulting?
I would say the ability to work with a lot of different clients and a lot of different industries. So one thing I love about working in-house is the fact that now I actually get to see something end to end. So from the moment we ideate, we conceptualize something, we develop it and we launch it, we can really see the impact of what we're doing. That's pretty cool. But at the same time, when you're in consulting and you're working with different clients at the same time, different industries at the same time, you get a bit of a better, like, how do I say this? It's a bit of a vantage point. You can see what this industry is doing. You can see what that client is doing. And that kind of precision that helps you kind of like zoom out, helps you kind of cross-pollinate ideas better. So a good example of that would be in consulting, I could be working in a project around e-commerce, and then 2 months later, I'll be doing a project in the automotive sector. And you might think that these two have nothing to do with each other. But actually, once you encounter a specific problem and you realize, oh, actually, this solution that this team came up with a few months ago might not work exactly the same for this new problem, but there's some learnings there. That just gives you like a whole lot more to choose from, or to get inspired from, or to get like learn from, and to bring it into this like new project or new context. And having that kind of constant flow of different teams, different approaches, different industries is really, really good for the creative process and really in general for the design process.
Yeah, that's really great to hear. And when we talk about sort of like combining what you used to do, which is service design, and what you do today, which is user experience design, yeah, can you share with us like a few projects as like examples of like where service design is integrated? And you mentioned it's not just about creating blueprints. It's not just about like creating all these like beautiful artifacts. Yeah.
Yeah, I can give you an example of something we've done recently within Zalora, actually, where we really had to take a service design lens. When you do like online shopping, it is pretty similar across a lot of products, right? Like you pick up your phone, you find something you like, and then you place an order. And basically for you as a user, you place that order, and then you kind of just expect a package to show up at your door. But all of the work that goes behind the scenes to make sure you get that package is actually quite complex. So the way it works for us, and the way that's pretty similar to the way it works for a lot of e-commerces, right? Like you place an order that goes to some sort of internal team or like a warehouse team, and then they select the product you want, they pick it, they pack it, and then they send it your way. So we had to kind of relook at the way some of these internal processes are happening. And we had to look specifically at one part of the journey where people are kind of like picking the products that you want and like sending them over to like the grouping, and then how they get sent over to you as a user. And it was pretty interesting project because it was not, like I said, it was not only about the blueprint, it also had a very big physical component to it. So what I mean by physical component is we had to come in and understand how the warehouse people were working, how they were moving from one segment of the warehouse to the other, right? And that's where the research and the observation becomes really, really critical, because we had to look at how often these people were working, how they were actually selecting the items. And I'll give you the example. What we did is pretty standard. Like we had to look at a specific kind of wearable to understand how they were kind of grabbing the different packages and kind of scanning the different products. The interesting thing about this project was that at the start, the request that came from the teams was, we need a few new screens for this specific like picking app. But we didn't really have the mandate to go and observe the warehouse. So we actually did that. And then we realized that, okay, this is about a little bit more than just the screens. It's about how we actually position that wearable, what that looks like, what is the amount of information that people need to see at each specific step. And we ended up kind of really like scraping down the amount of information we had on that interface and really like boiling it down to just like really critical information in those 1 or 2 points when you are kind of like picking up a product and grouping it. We then, so I think an interesting part of this that I want to talk about, because I think it's a very important part of service design, is also how you do service prototyping, right? How do you actually prototype this service? So one thing we needed to do was actually go on site, go to the warehouse. Once we had an idea of what people actually needed to see at every step of the process, we followed them around and we understood like, how were they walking? How much time did they take to go from one station to the next? And once we did that, we tried out our new solution and we had them kind of do the same flow. And that really gave us like a very good idea of what direction to take the end result in. Like I mentioned, at the end of the day, we created something like that was like a lot more simple than what we had originally envisioned. And a lot more easy just to carry, because there were a few interesting insights that came out, right? That you don't imagine. For example, the fact that a lot of the people that are working in the warehouse may not necessarily be very fluent in English. So we needed to make things a little bit more simple to understand in terms of the amount of content, the amount of complexity in some of the orders or in some of the descriptions. People are really pressed for time when they're doing a lot of these processes. So also another decision around like removing rather than adding content, right? Like if you are pressed for time and you don't have the ability to look through like a huge spreadsheet, you only need to look at 1 or 2 numbers, then you really shouldn't add more stuff in there. You should actually take away stuff. And those kind of things just kind of came together to make that new interface. And then to wrap it up, actually, the third part of this, which is actually also like a very important part in the process, was how we actually sold this solution, how we brought it on to like our internal stakeholders. So one thing that we usually do with the design teams is to kind of, I mean, it sounds pretty obvious, right? Like the show and not tell approach. So how do you show this new picking solution, this new app to people that probably don't spend a lot of time in the warehouse, but they need to okay on this project, right? And what we did there is we actually managed to do recordings of the people actually working with the new product. We did screenshots, we did interviews, and we kind of just brought all of that stuff back into the meeting room and explained it in a way that we kind of wanted to make sure that we told the story from the point of view of the people using the actual wearable, which was very, very far away from the person sitting in the meeting room, right? So we needed to make it as human-centric as possible, explain the different steps one by one, and really tell it from the point of view of like a story, rather than just these are the requirements and these are the new screens, but more like really telling the story of what are all the things that person needs to do, how they click, how they pick on the specific products, and everything to get you to that point of like actually, checking that off and sending it off as a package.
Yeah, thank you for sharing these three things with us. And I'm so glad we got more people joining the room now. And we got some questions from the audience itself. Some really, really great questions. So I'm just going to cherry pick a few. So there's a general sense on accessibility, and you spoke briefly about it, about accessibility. Was that part of your consideration as you were doing that specific project?
Yeah, 100%. I think first of all, we need to understand who our users are and who our users could potentially be, right? Like, and we really have to understand what could all these needs, unmet challenges be that we haven't really seen. So a really big part of this and is, having a solid research process right at the start of the project. And that means like I mentioned, right? Like one thing that made this specific project quite successful, and one thing that really defined how we designed, was to actually go and sit with the users and really understand. Because like I mentioned before, for example, not being able to kind of understand all of the content on the screens, that's not something that the engineers sitting in the room will normally think about. So I think it becomes our job as the designers to make all of that evident, to create evidence, to take pictures, to create interviews, to observe, and to convey all of that information back to the people who are building, to the people that are approving the projects, and to the decision makers. Really, I think it's our job as designers, whether it's service designers, UX designers, however you want to call it. It's our job as designers to really like not only put the user in the middle, but also like speak and advocate for that user and show that evidence of what are all the things that this specific user needs.
Yeah. And just as a follow-up question from another audience member, all these things, because your stakeholders requested for just a few screens, and you ended up doing so much more, right? And going very deep into it. So how did you manage to convince them some of these things that you were looking into was worth looking into? Yeah.
I think what has worked for me, that I can say is like the most powerful way to get like buy-in from stakeholders and to also like convince other people is, like I mentioned, show evidence. I think some of the most powerful user research projects or insights projects, stuff that we've done with the team, where we have gotten the best result is when we are able to show either it's C-suite or senior stakeholders, to show them video snippets of people actually talking about what their problems are, where we are able to kind of talk to people, sit down with them and show them that evidence of what is working and what is not working. That really does wonders to help people kind of get in the shoes of the users and understand why they should be investing in this solution or why they should be investing in this direction. I know it's like very easy to say like show, don't tell. That's a very typical thing to say, but showing the evidence and really like telling a story through it, and really like that kind of like it kind of removes all the kind of ability to have a discussion around it. If it's pretty obvious, if it's pretty clear, it's pretty obvious there on the video or on the picture, what is the issue and the issue that these users have, and also like showing the faces of the users and showing the voice of the users, letting them kind of talk is quite powerful.
Yeah, I think that's really great advice when you come to think about it. What did you meet any difficult stakeholders in this case, and did you have to take extra steps to do a bit more convincing?
Not in this project in specific, But there have been cases where you do like user research or you do like some insights gathering and the stakeholders don't really see the value of it. In cases like that, something we started doing recently, like in the last 2 years or so, and it's been really, really helpful, was to actually bring in some of these stakeholders into the actual interviews. Now, I'm very careful of how and when you actually bring in the stakeholders. I think you need to put a little bit of thought into that. I don't think it's recommendable to just like bring in stakeholders to every interview. But I do think it makes a difference when people kind of sit in the room and listen in with you. So we've thought a lot about this in the team because, like I mentioned, you also have to be very protective of your users and make sure that you don't run into the issue of like a stakeholder or a person kind of like hijacking the conversation, right? And trying to like go over the script. So what has worked for us is that we actually started streaming our user interviews. Every time we talk to end users and even some internal users, I will work with the researchers to, go through the interview, invite one or two specific stakeholders, and then if somebody else wants to join, for example, let's say I'm creating a solution for the customer service team, I can't really have all the customer service team in the call, but I can stream it. And we can kind of manage a little bit the participation and we can manage a little bit the engagement, but still having a little bit these like guardrails so that you don't run into the situation of having a user interview with 10 people from your team just like listening in, because that's also not a great space for your user to feel comfortable, right? So you should involve the stakeholders, and that's really, really powerful in specific moments and kind of like thinking through how you will involve them.
Yeah, great advice, I would say. And as a follow-up question from the same person, they ask, is stakeholder maturity important in this case? Like, let's say, assuming your stakeholders still don't get it. Yeah, then would you have to school them? Would you have to, what would you have to do just to get the project going? Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a very good question. What I've done in cases like this is I probably wouldn't try to involve them into a user interview at that point, because if the maturity of the team or of the client is not there, and what I mean by that is they don't really understand why we're doing this, then I think we need to take a few steps back and start by educating a little bit about why we need service design in the first place. The way I've seen this work very successfully with different teams and the way I've piloted this in different teams is you don't necessarily come in saying service design is going to solve everything for you. And this is this amazing new approach that we have for you that I've seen that very rarely work. What I have seen work, though, is teams that start by talking about service design or talking about user centricity in a way that is kind of like sprinkled onto other initiatives or onto like other messaging. Start bringing it in slowly into the teams or into your stakeholders. Start by showing a little bit of impact up front. And what I mean concretely by that, and what we've done with our teams, right, like is you wouldn't come in and say, everyone needs to learn about service design and this is going to change your world. But instead, you would come in and say, hey, we've been doing this work with the design team, and we've been talking to these users, and we've created like a visual to help understand the process a little bit more. And here's how we can help, like kind of integrating it into the conversation around impact is quite helpful. However, back to the original question, I do think it's important to always think about how you're going to educate your audience if they're not there yet, and to always think in parallel of your project, right? Like, how are you going to talk about service design? How are you going to share it to your teams? Who are your stakeholders, and what is the level of understanding and the level of buy-in they have into it already? So those are things that you usually consider.
Yeah, very, very good thoughts. And as a follow-up question, I was wondering, as we get into technicalities, someone was asking if do you create artifacts for service design like blueprints and journey maps specifically for each persona or user segments?
It really depends on the project, and it really depends on what we need. So even before I decide, okay, we need a blueprint or we need a persona, I like to work together with my team and decide what are we trying to find out and what is the best way to convey this information. Because I don't want, I don't think it's a good practice to kind of jump in day one and say, you guys need a blueprint, but I don't really understand the full extent of the problem or of the challenge, right? I think, like I mentioned at the start, artifacts are a great tool to communicate, but that's exactly what they are. They're a tool for communication. They're not the end deliverable of your project. They're a tool for you to get involvement. They are a tool for you to get people excited, and they are a tool to drive change. But they're not the end result, right? So when it comes specifically to service blueprinting, I've done blueprints for specific personas. If what we're trying to find out and what we're trying to evidence is going to look very different, depending on each of these personas. We've also done, I'm trying to think of like recent examples that we've done within Zalora. Right now, we're currently working on blueprinting a lot of our internal processes. For example, like how do we deliver better services? How do we enable a lot of these internal teams? And to be honest, there is no like cookie cutter solution. It can look very different depending on the complexity, depending on what you're actually studying. And what I mean by that, I'll give you a very clear example of something that we're looking at now. We're looking at a specific process in the back end, has to do a little bit with like how some of the teams work together. The real challenge that we want to solve there is how the teams hand over work from one team to another. So something as like showing what steps you need to take in the process, that's not really valuable for us. It's more important to identify where are the gaps from teams to teams, right? So it's going to be a blueprint that is really focused on evidencing those. So visually, what that will look like is it's going to be less in the direction of a process map, and it's going to be a lot heavier in terms of who are all the actors and when do those actors hand over specific parts of the process. And then I would be sure to capture what are the emotions and what are the frictions and what are the kind of thoughts and intents going from one team to the other. And I would also really focus on capturing, for example, where are the frustrations? And that can be a blueprint I'm building right now, but I can be building something completely different 6 months from now when I'm looking at, for example, I don't know, like looking at a homepage blueprint.
Yeah, thank you for going into details. And I just want to kind of also summarize a couple of points since you shared quite a lot. That you are advocating going by the approach of sprinkling this approach or this thinking in the process as you're solving problems as a designer. It doesn't matter what they call you, right? I mean, you're wearing a design cap, whether you're a UX researcher, whether you're a UX designer, you're using some of these service design concepts and methodology to solve problems, and you're sprinkling them. You're not trying to alienate people. You're trying to get people to just see the value of things and trying to just show them the current state, right? Where some of our methods in UX design might be a little bit more limited because it doesn't fall into service design, so to speak, right? It's more on the product side, it's more on the digital experience. So I think I want to highlight that, and that's really very useful. And I think as you were describing the solution and on how you bring your stakeholders on board or how you solve the problems, it feels no different from the UX design process.
Yeah.
and and you just decide for yourself, oh, I have this toolkit that I have, and you just decide which one to pick. And yeah, I'm just very fascinated by that. And that's because you have a service design background, right? Let's say today I don't have a service design background. I'm just a UX designer, or I'm a UX researcher. How do I learn these tools, and then how do I add them to my artifacts or things that I can use and apply to projects? Yeah.
So just to add on to something very interesting you said, right? Like the whole point around sprinkling. One of the best pieces of advice that I've gotten from a friend who's also a very talented service designer is when you need to bring in service design to an organization, don't call it service design, and make sure to not use very fancy words and very like specific, like technical terms, because that's where you're going to lose your audience. And I think that's very powerful, because I think sometimes we're victims of kind of like really focusing on like the right technical word and the right tool and the right this. And while it's great and we get it, the reality is a lot of the times, if we're doing our job well, right, like we're not just sitting within the design team, we're working with teams across the entire organization that have never heard of service design, have never done a blueprint. And you coming in and bringing in this completely new tool, completely new way of working is more likely than not going to alienate them and make them feel like, wow, this sounds really scary. I've never done something like this. So your job is also to kind of like help kind of put people at ease and kind of reduce the barrier and try to make it less scary. And that really helps. So then to your second point around like, how do I get started in service design if I'm really focused on UX design? You mentioned something very interesting that I think is very true. There's a lot of kind of overlaps, especially when it comes to the mindset and kind of like the thinking, which for me is like the core of it, really. What I would recommend is you're already doing a lot of things that are quite important in the service design practice, which is thinking about your users first, kind of trying to understand their pain points, their challenges, where they're coming from. So now that you already have that understanding, where it kind of goes a little bit deeper is when you start also looking at it like not just what happens in the front stage. And by front stage, I mean, I'll give you the example of my current company. Front stage is there's an app where I can shop and I'm shopping on it. And that's kind of like the interface that I interact with as a user. Start thinking also about what I mentioned, right? Like what are all the internal warehousing teams, processes, touch points, things that need to happen in order for you to get that service fulfilled. And that may or may not be a digital touch point. It could be a platform. A lot of the times it is, but it could also be a process. So you will also be designing processes. You will also be thinking about spaces, how teams interact with each other, and all sorts of touch points, right? Like sometimes in service, in my journey as a service designer, I've had to look at emails and scripts for customer service agents. These are also touch points. And these are also things that we need to think about when designing a service. So a lot of it is already there. And I would just kind of like zoom out and kind of open up a little bit, like what are these other kind of touch points that you could start thinking about?
Yeah, really excellent points overall. Got a few questions to go through. Uh, so let's go back to your time in consulting, and you know, what's like one sort of, sorry, I'm just kind of trying to read the question over here. Okay, so I'm currently working in-house and considering to shift to consulting. Could you tell me what kind of final products or deliverables do you have to do as a service design consultant? Yes.
So I would, if I were to compare the work I'm doing now to the work that I was doing in consulting, I think what was required more from me and my teams was the communication, a little bit around like the strategies that you build together, the decks. I know that's not like a fun part of the process to talk about the decks and to talk about the PowerPoints, but the reality is, as a consultant, you come in to consult and you come in to give advice and to show blind spots where the team doesn't have the bandwidth or cannot see them, right? So a big part of your role as a consultant is to be able to communicate efficiently, to be able to identify what are the blind spots, what are the gaps, and to be able to convey them and to share them out to audiences and do it in a way that is persuasive, right? So these days I find myself doing a lot less slide decks, but that doesn't mean that that the work is that much different, right? Like when you move into consulting, there's definitely a bigger, I wouldn't say a stress, but there's a bigger importance in how you communicate ideas. Because remember what I said at the start, right? Like you're coming in as an outsider. So you have to be a very good communicator to talk about how, or to bring across the point that you understand the business, you understand the needs, and you understand what needs to happen, and you can give recommendations on what needs to happen. So I would say the first thing you need to work on, or that I would recommend working on if I were starting tomorrow in consulting, would be like really focus on the communication skills and how you convey strategies, how you convey insights reports, how you convey next steps and roadmaps and plans. I would say that's like the main thing.
Yeah, and there's a sort of a related question that was asked by an audience member, if let's say I'm approaching a company or a business and they don't really understand what service design is, I think this is still a fairly new thing here in this part of the world, especially. So, what can I do about it? I heard hints of what you were sharing. I mean, try not to alienate people, try to understand the business problem. But yeah, like I'm sure you have some very tangible advice, like trying to guide your clients along the way. Yeah.
So usually, at least in my experience, when you're trying to convince on what is the value of service design, you usually have to do that convincing to business stakeholders or to the teams that are kind of like putting in the budgets and deciding what to work on, right? And a really great way to talk about why this is important is to show some case studies and to show some numbers and to really tie like the why you should invest, for example, in building up a blueprint. You can tie that together with some examples of companies that have done that successfully and how it's worked for them. And there's a lot of content of this online. There's a lot of great reports. So if I were to recommend, like, there's a really great report that McKinsey launched, I think in 2018. It's been like a few years already, called The Business Value of Design. And it focuses on more in the direction of like service design and strategic design around why companies that invest in making processes visible and tangible, of using user-centric techniques, how these companies that invest in these practices really outperform all of their peers. There's numbers around this everywhere. There's like a lot of really great content that I think if you want to tell that story, make sure that it's backed up by numbers.
Excellent point. And yeah, I've seen McKinsey invest a lot in design and also release a lot of reports related to it, knowing that now McKinsey has McKinsey design as a practice. Yeah. So, how do you handle challenges or conflicts with fellow designers, and how do you resolve them if you have been into challenges and conflicts with fellow designers? Yeah.
Well, I think there's no easy solution to that. I think the key, or what has worked for me in the past, is really setting up clear communication and kind of talking through things. At the end of the day, like your design team and all the teams you work with, right? Like they're people, and where there is miscommunication or there is an issue, there's also a conversation to be had around what is the frustration, where is it coming from, and kind of how to manage it. I can't stress enough how important it is to have like constant, clear communication around expectations, and also to just like listen and try to kind of manage from that side.
Yeah, I say it really depends on the context, but yeah, if you like to be more specific, Jess, happy to get Adela here to elaborate a little bit more. So, I didn't get to ask you this earlier. You know, you've done service design work in Europe, and you've now done service design work here in Southeast Asia. Um, yeah, what are you noticing that's quite different? Or what are you
Um,
noticing that's the same?
a lot of things the same and a lot of things different. So if I thought about this a lot really, and so two main buckets, right? Like on a general lens, and then on the project work side of things. And on the general lens, there's this whole discussion around the design maturity of a company. And what my experience was working in Europe is that, at least in I also was in a specific field, so I was working in service design consultancies, companies that had been delivering service design already for many years, where the type of clients that we worked for already had a very good understanding of what was service design, and they were already used to buying service design projects. So there's a bit of well-established understanding of the value that service design can bring. As I said, that's not the case with every company. That was specifically the case with the companies I worked in. But I did notice that like there's a little bit more maturity in terms of people understanding what service design is and how to work with it and what value it can bring. So I did a little scan of the market today, and I was looking on LinkedIn just out of curiosity, like how many openings are there for service designers in Singapore? And it ties along to the point around design maturity, because I found 171 job openings as of this morning. But when I looked a little bit deeper, they weren't really like service design titled. So they were looking for all sorts of designers that could do service design roles. And that's quite interesting because 171 is not a lot for an economy that is so like service driven. So I don't want to say that, I think it's too simple to just say like high maturity, low maturity. What I do want to say is that even though there might not be like a general understanding of what is service design yet, and not every company is paying for it or willing to pay for it, there is definitely a lot of interest. And what I've noticed in Singapore, working here also in consultancies, is that there's a very growing demand and interest for service design. Just the fact, I also read actually a very interesting work by the Design Singapore Council. They had a press release recently, and they said that Singapore's design workforce grew by 25% in terms of demand, right? Like specifically driven by non-design sectors. So what that means is that even though we wouldn't necessarily call it like a service design mature market yet, there's definitely a lot of demand. And just the fact that it's growing, especially from non-design sectors, means that there's an increase every day a little bit more in terms of maturity. Because the more companies are asking for these roles or asking for service design related work or outcomes, it means that there's an interest and it's growing. That's the first one, right? Like a little bit about the design maturity. From my side, on a more personal lens, one of the biggest differences that I've noticed is really like what is important to a lot of teams and a lot of companies. Again, this really depends on the company and it really depends on the industry. But something that I kept hearing a lot more of while I was working in Berlin was this focus towards sustainability, and this focus or kept teams talking more about like long-term service design and the impact and thinking about like long-term impact. While what I've tended to see more in companies here, there's still a focus in innovation, but it's more fast-paced. It's more around like what you tend to hear more in conversations is conversation around like fast-paced business growth and more of a commitment towards efficiency and technological adoption. And it's important, but from a different lens, what I've noticed a lot of projects from my time working in a consultancy in Singapore is also like a lot of demand around projects that focus on digital transformation, scalability, and one that keeps coming up, I think, both in-house and in consulting quite a lot is the becoming like really like tech first, tech savvy, tech driven. You don't hear that much from other markets, which I think is a very cool thing about this market in specific. Like it's very all around like fast-paced business growth and efficiency. And then the last thing is really something that I've noticed specifically when working in service design projects here and there. And it's around collaboration, which I think it's something that I've thought about a lot. In Europe, my experience was that more collaborative, flat organizational structures were pretty common. And things like workshops and co-creations and involving all levels of the organization tended to be kind of like pretty common, nothing special. While here, I mean, collaboration still happens. And like I said, it really depends on the team and on the industry, but the way you get buy-in and the way you get people like working on workshops with you and collaborating on workshops with you, I feel like you have to put a little bit more work in creating safe spaces where hierarchy or communication styles is not such a big thing, or that you at least kind of like create the safe space within that workshop so that you can hear different voices from different levels across all of the teams. And I'm talking specifically about, for example, building blueprints for very large corporate clients within this market, right? Like you really have to do a little bit of extra work just to like break the ice and really make sure that everybody feels comfortable, because that's not how you naturally carry out meetings at all times.
Yeah, so I'm smiling because I mean you're like applying service design to designing the entire experience of going through a workshop as well. So it's almost like, oh, it's like a double inception, one could say. Um, and yeah, that's really interesting for me to hear. And it's actually a really good segue to this question I'm wondering, which is about skill sets. And so it looks like you have to have pretty strong facilitation skills as a service designer here, especially in this part of the world. Are there any other skill sets that a service designer needs to have? Yeah, even if they overlap with the UX designer. Yeah.
100% facilitation is at the top of my list. I'm glad you brought it up. And there's, I think here and everywhere, really, it's like a really critical part of your toolbox. There's other two that I want to talk about, but first a little bit more on workshop facilitation, right? And also not just workshop facilitation, like meeting facilitations, facilitation of interactions, even like town halls and how you present or talk about service design to like bigger audiences. All of these should be intentional. And when they are intentional and when you put a little bit of thinking into them, you make them a lot more powerful. And I consider that facilitation as well, right? Like it's how do you get messaging across? How do you get people to interact? How do you get people bought into something? That is all facilitation. I think the second one that I would really like to talk about is the ability to structure problems and insights, the ability to kind of really define the problem space, to prioritize problems, and to be able to kind of break them down into different parts, right? I think that's a very important part of the day-to-day of a service designer. And really closely linked to this one. I consider this to be like step one, and then step two, how you actually present out and how you actually socialize those insights or share that information. There's a saying we usually say in Spanish, maybe they say it in a lot of other places, but it goes like, what you say is equally as important as how you say it, right? So I think this applies, and sometimes it's even more important. I think this applies to a lot of things. And while the first part is how you make sense of your thoughts, how do you cater or customize what you're saying to your audience and your understanding of who you're talking to, how they are going to receive your content, how familiar are they with what you're talking about, versus how do you actually show. I think these are like super, super important and super closely linked. And where service design comes in, I think, to the second part, right? Like the ability to make things tangible and visual and interesting is where you can bring a lot of value as a service designer when it comes to creating these artifacts and, for example, putting together a storyboard where you really tell the story of a user. Or like I mentioned earlier, like what are the snippets of your interviews? What are those pieces of evidence you're going to piece together to tell a story? How do you put all of those insights together to deliver a very impactful message, or a message that your stakeholders will say like, okay, we need to act on this, or this is quite important for our strategy. Like, let's focus on this. Yeah, so I would, if I had to boil it down, it would be workshop facilitation for sure, the ability to structure problems and insights, and then how you actually convey and share those out and socialize those out to your organization.
Yeah, I think those are, thank you for just like being so concise on those three skill sets. And it almost seems like if you're a competent designer, if you're a little bit more senior, if you're going into a design leadership role, even all these are essential skills you need to get anyway, to be good at what you do as a leader. So someone asked in the audience, if I'm not a designer, but I'm looking to explore roles in the service design space, what would be the best way to break into the space, you know? Yeah, how did you manage to end up having a service design job back in Germany? Yeah.
That's very interesting because I actually didn't start off as a service designer. So I actually started off in advertising. I was a visual communications designer that was unhappy and decided to go back to school because I thought there was something a little bit more. And I wanted to learn also about the business side of things. And I was very curious about a lot of things that you usually don't learn about in a traditional design school curriculum. So I went back and I got a master's in strategic design with focus on service design. And then I just started looking for internships in service design. And I was a career switcher. So I wasn't like completely new to the workforce, but no matter, right? Like I just wanted to learn. And I think that's the advice I would give to someone else who's trying to break into service design. Before I do that, I do want to call out, it doesn't necessarily, like, to be a service designer, you don't need a design background. A lot of the best service designers that I've worked with, people that I've learned a lot from, have been anthropologists, have been business backgrounds, have been psychologists. So you can come from a lot of different backgrounds and move into service design, and you can also continue doing what it is you're doing, and pick up service design tools or pick up service design mindset and infuse that into your work. There's a lot of different pathways, and there's no like cookie cutter one way to do things. And then back to the point around like, how do you get started, right? When I reflect and think back, like what helped me kind of get an understanding for, or a taste for service design and try and, just like start, working more and more, is first of all, try to network, because service design is relatively new, especially in our market, which means that also when it comes to like the literature around it, there's not a lot of literature around it. There's not a lot of degrees that easily found. So what you're going to have to do is actually try to attend as many events as possible, including and especially service design meetups. So something that really helped me when I just got started is I attended as many service design jams and global jams as possible. And the way those work, they do like really cool ones in Berlin, where you basically come in and you get paired up with, it's a bit like a hackathon, you get paired up with other service designers, people that are already working in the industry, and you have a weekend to solve a problem, or you have a few hours to solve a problem. And that, looking back, helped me do like lightning jumps in terms of like getting my hands-on experience, because I got the chance to sit down, talk, and work with people that were already working in the industry. And I think it's always like a lot better to kind of like learn by doing and to actually try out some of these problems. The second piece of advice that I would give is, and I think this applies especially for blueprinting, for facilitation, if you've never done any of those things, try to jump in and just do a few. I know it might seem a little bit scary because service blueprints in itself, they're like super complex, super big things that I see a lot of designers trying to get into service design and reading about blueprints, but not having actually completed a blueprint. Try to go in there and do a few with the mindset that you are going to mess up on those first few times, but that's okay. It's better to complete 4, 5, 6, and then really get the hang of it. But you won't get there unless you actually jump in and just start. And I have a lot of stories of terrible facilitation, stories of things that went wrong or where I didn't learn like how to manage an audience. But the only way I got better was by getting back in there and doing more, and having a good kind of mentor or a good system or a good team where I could be constantly getting feedback on what worked and what didn't. And you can be lucky and have a really good team around you, or you can also create that for you and constantly ask for feedback from other facilitators that you are setting up these workshops with or you're working on these blueprints with. So yeah, those are like the two main things that, thinking back, kind of helped me.
I would say those are good advice, and definitely. Wait, I mean, did specializing in service design not help as well and back in school?
It helped, but if I'm very honest, what really helped is getting the hands-on experience. Like that
Okay,
was really like the game changer.
awesome. So someone's really interested and is asking, where can I join one of those design jams?
So service design jams actually happen globally. I would need to check if there's one that's happening in Singapore, but you can also dial in and join some of
Cool.
these world service jams globally.
Awesome. And I hear there's going to be a global meetup of service designers in Helsinki in Finland in a month or so. Apparently, some of our alumni are now service designers, so they are actually going to fly there and join that
Nice.
event. Yeah, so and sometimes we get really interesting requests. They ask me, Daylon, does your program sort of like help train you to be a service designer? And I'm like scratching my head. I'm not a service designer. I don't really know. But today, after listening to this conversation, I'm so much more aware what a good service designer should be doing. And I think I can say yes, somewhat. I can't say confidently 100%, but yes, somewhat. It does give you that part of that foundation.
Yeah.
And someone's asking you about your sort of like, advancing your career. So you were a service designer first, and then now you're like the head of UX, and you have projects related to service design. So what are your career goals for the next 3 to 5 years?
Sounds like an interview question. Yeah, so I'm really passionate. So when I transitioned from like an individual contributor into a more of a management role, I was really looking to get the opportunity to work with teams and to work with people. And that's been a really great journey. And I want to keep doing that a little bit more. But I also want to as a next step, maybe think a little bit about going back into, driving some of these projects, doing a little bit more hands-on work. And I think at this point, it's not actually, building the blueprint, but more like, I'm really interested in projects where I can actually have those conversations with the stakeholders, be more of like an enabler or force to help the design teams kind of do these projects, have the right setup. So I think, everybody's career path looks very different. But I think from my point of view, once you actually, get pretty good at service design and you manage to do a little bit of work with helping and leading the teams, I think the next step is to start advocating for them and to start becoming more of a strategic consultant for the teams, and to also become a voice in the organization where you are like pushing for the need for design, or where you're pushing for the need to be user-centric, or pushing for the impact that service design can bring in the organization. So I wouldn't put a title on it because that can look so different from company to company, but I would like to move more in that direction.
Yeah, that sounds great. And just as a point of curiosity, are there like specialized tools that service designers use?
Specialized what?
Tools like programs or software that service designers use?
That's a funny question because a lot of the work we do is actually Post-its, Sharpies, and paper. I use a lot of paper and pens to visualize things and to explain things to my stakeholders. It's going to sound very boring, but we also do a lot of decks and a lot of like data visualization on both Figma and FigJump, but nothing super fancy, I would say.
So lots of transferable skill sets if you're already a UX designer then.
100%.
Excellent. Okay, so as a final question, what's one advice you would give to your younger self? Yeah, just in general, if or to the people here who are young and hungry and starting a career now.
Yeah, I would say, even if it sounds new and even if it sounds like a little bit out of your comfort zone, just dive headfirst and try it out. And it's important to say, like, dive headfirst without the expectation that you're going to do it perfect. It's not going to be perfect. Like I mentioned, right? Like I can think of all the I feel like I can facilitate quite well at this point, but it wasn't always like that. At the start, it was very, very difficult for me. It was very difficult for me to speak in public, much worse to facilitate a workshop that sounded super scary maybe 10 years ago. But the only way I started getting better was to admit and accept that it will not be good. It will not be good for the first few times, and you just have to keep doing it and doing it. And slowly, the fear goes away, and you slowly start feeling more confident in what you do. And I think that's the core of also like pretty much every other craft, right? Like you have to keep working on it and be okay with failing a little bit because it's going to happen, but then it's slowly going to get better.
Well, really, really excellent advice. And thank you so much, Adela, for joining us for this session and sharing your experiences and helping us to demystify and decode what exactly is service design. It's so much clearer now. I can now explain it to people. And thank you so much for being here with us. And thank you to all our wonderful audience members from Tokyo to London to Singapore and Malaysia. Thank you for all your wonderful questions. I hope you had a very, very fun session. I do have good news for those of you who are joining us for our next session. Our next session is actually going to be live in person in Singapore. So if you'd like to join us, feel free to keep a lookout later this week for the registration details. We'll be having next session around this time, I think 9th of October at Monk's Brew Club, which is in Paya Lebar, and we are going to talk on the topic of innovation design. So from service design, now we're going to talk about innovation design, which is another discipline. So do join us if you're available. And thank you so much, Adela, for your time.
Thank you so much.
All right, take care, everyone.